the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, but if not, maybe leave us a review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate all our patrons and listeners. Today, Taylor and I are pleased to bring you Ian Buchanan, Professor of Critical Theory and Cultural Studies at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Ian is the author and editor of many books, some which include Deleuzism, a Metacommentary, Fredric Jameson, Life Theory, and most recently, The Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis, collected essays on Deleuze and Guattari, and the topic of today's discussion, Assemblage Theory and Method, an introduction and guide. But Ian, we're so pleased to have you. Long time coming, I think, that, we've not had you on the show, but welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We've had you in our sights for a while. As I mentioned, we had Claire Colebrook on recently, and I think it was around that time where I was like, okay, I need to reach out to Ian. And so I'm really glad that you're here to talk shop with us, talk Deleuze. Before we get started, I mentioned beforehand, I think you provide an interesting aspect of your origin story in the Before D&G Studies essay, right, which bookends the Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis. And so maybe I thought that could be an example of an anecdote or a part of your origin story that you could share for the audience and for us, just to get to know you a little bit better and how you came into, whether it be philosophy, Deleuze, etc. Just tell us about yourself.
So this story kind of dates me because part of the story is that when I started working on Deleuze, there were less than a handful of books. I mean, literally, as I say in my book, you could sort of comfortably read everything that had been written about Deleuze and Guattari in about a week. And if you confined yourself just to English, you could probably do it in an afternoon. So to even be interested in Deleuze at that time was to be interested in something that was considered ultra niche, completely esoteric, and definitely a bad career move. And I wasn't interested in Deleuze. When I started writing my thesis, I was in a kind of cultural studies, comparative literature program, and I was mostly interested in cultural studies, but the people that I wanted to work with were in comparative literature. So I kind of had to persuade these comp-lit people that really cultural studies was interesting too. And I was kind of coming through I was very, very interested in the concept of everyday life. I'd read Henri Lefebvre and Michel de Certeau, and I was kind of just interested in the sort of extraordinariness of the ordinary. And when I proposed my PhD project, I said to them, look, I'm not exactly sure what I do, but what I want to do. But the question that interests me the most is, why do people do the things that they do? The more banal, the better. Like, I don't get fishing. Like, people go fishing. I cannot understand fishing at all. It looks boring as hell to me. I don't eat fish, so I guess that's part of the reason. But I kind of admire the fact that people do fishing and that they do like it. So I'm interested. How do you begin to theorize that? And I thought Michel de Certeau offered some interesting insights into that. And I remember going to various sort of grad seminars, and someone said to me, oh, you've got to read Anti-Oedipus. It'll be, really helpful to you. And to be honest, when I first heard that suggestion, I thought, this just sounds like faddish nonsense to me, and I don't really care about psychoanalysis and Oedipus and all that sort of stuff. So I was kind of reluctant to read it, but as I said in my book, initially decided just to read it so I could dismiss it and be like, well, I've read it and I think it's rubbish. I'm not going to be pursuing that any further.
The new flashy Hegel, right? It's not a new flashy Hegel, right?
Exactly. But to my surprise, I was absolutely intrigued by it. I mean, irritated too, right? Because I couldn't understand it. And I knew that I didn't understand it. And somehow it kind of hooked me such that I wanted to understand it. And I was kind of irritated by the fact that I knew I didn't have the background or the resources to understand it. So in the best possible way, it motivated me to then put together huge reading lists, and I went off and read a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm still doing that. And I think the thing when I get kind of cranky at other people who write about Deleuze is I kind of get cranky at the fact that they haven't really taken the time to really try to understand what they actually said, to sort of decode through the layers and think, well, what are they really trying to say here? They kind of just grab concepts from here and there, and it's sort of like hundreds and thousands, sprinkle them over everything like fairy dust.
Right.
Well, surely there's something much more interesting going on here if only we were willing to take the time to figure out what that was. And so that's really been the trajectory of my time since finishing my PhD, is to just kind of keep diving deeper and deeper into what I think they offer, and at the same time sort of testing my knowledge of it by trying to interpret other things using their concepts and so forth, and to see whether or not that somehow deepens my understanding of those things. And I would admit that most of my attempts have been fairly provisional, and I think I got some things right, probably got some things wrong. And, I feel like I'm always progressing, always getting to a sort of a deeper level of understanding. So I'm kind of happy with how that has gone, and it continues to fascinate. So, I have no regrets about finally picking up Anti-Oedipus.
I mean, it does sound like it did pan out as a career move, and maybe at the time it would have been, in the mid 90s, it would have been Renegade. It would have been a long shot, but it definitely panned out for you. I mean, some of the things you mentioned, I had forgotten about Deleuze Camp, which is something that's been around. When did it actually start? I mean, mid
2007.
Okay, it's always been something I've wanted to go to, and just never panned out for me. So maybe one of these years
we'll have to go sometime. I mean, I thought about maybe this year would be good, but we were planning on going to the Gettysburg thing, so maybe next year we'll think.
Next year's in Stockholm.
Oh,
very nice.
That's interesting.
That sounds
and then
good.
The year after will be in Athens.
We have a war chest building, as we like to call it. So we'll definitely set aside funds for that. So you've participated in Deleuze Camp. Were you involved with its inception?
Yeah, see, that's how long it's been going. People forgot that I started it.
Okay, that's why I was making sure that I got that right. Okay.
Yeah, so it started in 2007 at Cardiff University, which is where I was working at the time. And I had been kind of inspired by talking to people about the Marxist literary group that Jameson used to be part of, and I think has been at recently. And I thought that it would be kind of cool if we could do something like that relating to Deleuze's work. And I think also part of it for me was I just wanted to be able to teach Deleuze. I couldn't really teach it with my undergraduates. Wasn't the kind of program where that would really work. I maybe could do one lecture, but I couldn't do it in great intensity.
I see.
And through just a kind of a happy kind of conjunction of events, Paul Patton, Greg Lambert, and Dan Smith were all going to be in the UK that summer. And so I kind of got in contact with all of them, and Claire, who was still at Edinburgh at that time, and asked her to come down. And I said, look, let's do a summer camp for a week. And they were all kind of happy to be part of it. So they all came to Cardiff for a week, and we started it. And it was amazing. It was like the first group of students that came to it. Not all of them were grad students. Some of them were already full professors. And it was super intense. And, I've never had so much intense conversation. And there's nothing like, trying to teach Deleuze to a room full of people who are actually already experts in Deleuze. So
right.
If anything's going to sharpen up your knowledge of something, it's going to be that, right? And so it was fantastic. So we did it again the following year when I did the first Deleuze conference in Cardiff as well. And I had always hoped that it would be, I always thought the problem with Deleuze conferences is that they were completely random and happenstance, and might be one year, not the next year, whatever. And you could never plan. So when I did the first conference, and it was done to support the journal, because I knew the best way to support the journal was to, and other journals have done this.
Deleuze and Guattari studies. Is that where you're?
Yeah, right. Okay. So a lot of journals do this, where you have an annual conference, and everybody who comes to the conference basically has a subscription built into the registration, and it builds the community of the journal, keeps the subscriptions ticking over, and it creates a kind of momentum. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that we needed something like that. So when I organized the first conference in Cardiff, I also then spoke to friends in Germany and Copenhagen and Amsterdam, and said, look, what we want to do now is try to create momentum. So I asked them to agree to organizing conferences, and we planned it sort of 3 years ahead of the Cardiff conference. So everybody knew from the moment the Cardiff conference happened, there were still 3 more conferences in train. And essentially that's what we've done ever since. We just kind of keep, I talk to different people at all the conferences and constantly try to think who can be doing it next. So we've always got at least 2 to 3 conferences organised in a row so that people can plan. Like in Australia, we have sort of government research grants you can apply for, and some of them last for 3 or 4 years, and you're expected to put in that grant, I'm going to be going to a conference in wherever 4 years from now. And so what we wanted to do is to make that possible. So people could say, I'm going to apply for a research grant, and now I know that 2 years from now the conference is going to be in Athens, so I can plan that today. And I think that's been really important. Like it's created momentum, it's created a community. And so the same people come back to the conferences and, they see all your friends and so forth. So I really love it. Like it's a really nice thing to have happened.
You created an assemblage or various assemblages, it sounded like, right? That's the collective assemblage of enunciation right there.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, we're going to get into your book, but I do think, as I just mentioned, it does kind of make some sense into maybe why you're interested in assemblage theory. And I do think now I'm framing it like this: is the organizational attempts at the Deleuze camp and then the conferences tied into the output of these collections on Deleuze? I mentioned several of them here that you've co-edited with a number of people, including Greg Lambert, I'm sure Claire, I can't remember everybody, but, just name a few: Deleuze in Politics, Deleuze in Literature, Deleuze in Feminist Theory, Deleuze in the Contemporary World, Deleuze in Space. I'm sure I'm leaving out a number of them, and many of them tied to Edinburgh, which you mentioned was where Claire was at. So I'm curious about how you ramped up that organizational framework into these publications, and really, I assume, helped to make Edinburgh University Press kind of the Deleuze powerhouse it is today.
Yeah, so when I finished my thesis, I submitted it for publication. I can't even remember why I chose Edinburgh University Press as the place to send it. It may have been Claire might have suggested it. I literally can't remember. It's 25 years ago. So anyway, I sent it to them and they accepted it. And then I said, look, I think it's shit. I'm going to rewrite it. So so I withdrew it. I mean, who does that, right? So I withdrew it. And so my actual PhD has never been published. What is published kind of as my PhD, Deleuzism, is not my PhD. It's a different book altogether.
Right.
I rewrote that and then they published that. And then I organized a conference on Deleuze in 1995. It was 96, to which Jameson was invited as a keynote speaker. And then he kind of suggested that I edit a copy of South Atlantic Quarterly and do a kind of a special issue of the journal. So I did that. And I kind of like the editing side of things. One of the criticisms of that conference and practically every conference ever since is that there was a real lack of feminist and gender scholarship there. And not through any kind of conscious exclusion, just simply there weren't really enough women interested in Deleuze, and there still kind of isn't enough women interested in Deleuze to be writing about it. And so in conversation with Claire, I said, well, look, the obvious response to that criticism is to try to edit a volume and try to bring together gender and feminist scholars and put it together in a book and perhaps create some momentum. And so we did that, and I consciously chose not to contribute to the volume itself, but just to be part of the editorial of it and to sort of make it happen. And I remember when I was doing it that I said to Edinburgh University Press, who were interested in publishing, I said, look, I think this is going to be a thing. We're going to want to do more of these. I think we should create it as a series. Now, bear in mind, I'd literally only just finished my PhD. So they were kind of like looking at me thinking, you're like, who the hell are you?
I love it. I love you taking these wagers. But go on.
And so fair enough. But I said to them, look, how about we don't have a series, because they really didn't want to do a series, but let's design it as though it was going to be a series. And they were like, oh, okay, we can do that because, it doesn't really cost them anything to do it. And so they did that, and that first volume was quite successful. So I said, well, we've got some ideas for some more. They said, okay, well, we'll try doing that. And so then for a little while, they just kind of pretended it wasn't a series, but followed my idea of a design aesthetic such that each volume looked like it was part of a series. And it's probably 5 or 6 books in before they finally go, okay, fine, it is a series. And then we formalized it and turned it into something. But again, it was like, I knew that it was so obvious from the Deleuze conference that I organized in Perth, which I thought we'd get like, I don't know, maybe 50 people. And we got like 200. And this is in 96. So bear in mind, Perth is like, the most isolated capital city in the world. It's not easy for even Australians to get to. Like, it's 4,000
Interesting.
kilometers from Sydney, right? Like, it's not anywhere. And that's why I didn't really do anything more until I got to Cardiff, because once I got to Cardiff, I realized, well, from Cardiff, within a 2-hour flight, you can practically reach anywhere in Europe. There's 300 million people within 2 hours. It suddenly became possible to organize conferences and have events and so on. But from Perth, it was impossible. And yet we still got 200 people. And so to me, that was a pretty strong indication that there was really global interest in Deleuze, and suddenly, like, his moment had arrived. I think Foucault was probably 20 years premature in announcing that it was going to be all about Deleuze. But certainly by the late 90s, that definitely started to come true.
Okay, so then you're saying Deleuze and Feminist Theory would have been the first of those books to kind of constitute that series. I mean, lovingly, I think of them as the Deleuze, and it's almost like the first rule of improv, right? But Deleuze edition.
Everybody calls it that.
Yeah.
I think we have a different official name. I can't even remember what it is myself, but that's what everyone calls it, and it seems not inappropriate. And of course, within 1,000 Plateaus, the whole and has always been a form of resonance. So it has always worked, and that's what I said to Edinburgh. I said, look, Deleuze and Guattari has always been about the sort of radical conjunction of things. So let's just push it and see how far it'll go.
That's really good, and I'm glad that added a little bit more background and gives a clearer picture, because I do think that they're still indisputably like great resources for whether you're interested in one particular topic, or you're really trying to maybe branch out, or even to collect some materials, some of these secondary materials that can help deep dive into a particular subject. I think that they're great, and they're really useful to have access to.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that one of the reasons why I started the conference, and then we started the monograph series Plateaus, is I say this at every single conference, but what became very clear to me quite early on is that I was graduating PhD students who were studying with me, but obviously loads of people around the world were also doing the same thing. And I said, well, these people need to be able to get jobs. And this was something that Fredric Jameson once said to me as well about Marxism. He said, the important thing to remember about Marxism within the institution is, if you're graduating students, can they get jobs? And so it seemed really important that we actually take care of business and think about credentializing Deleuze in a way that would enable PhD students to get jobs on the other side of it. And I know it sort of feels like a bit like a dirty word to talk about, but to me, it felt irresponsible just to be encouraging people to write sort of random PhDs on Deleuze with no prospect of a job. So I thought, well, we can change that. We can credentialize it. We can create the kind of academic environment that the institution recognizes as job worthy, and do ourselves a favor, and at the same time help people to publish really interesting books. So to me, that seemed like a logical progression. So that's sort of the way I took it.
I think that's really interesting, because it's not an analytic continental divide so much as an American, Europe divide. And I'm just in the Anglophone world, because it still seems like there are maybe little pockets of Deleuzism in America, but a lot of the departments, one of the departments that's welcomed them in, I think, is Complet, right? That's indisputable. But philosophy departments, it's very few and far between. There are some little pockets of, even continental programs seem to be behind the times, if you will. If this is the Deleuze times, they seem to be resistant to Deleuze. And let's not even talk about Guattari, who, if we go by their definition of philosophy as the creation of concepts, I mean, Deleuze would say Guattari is like the most philosophical philosopher out there. He's a philosopher's philosopher, because he is wildly creating concepts. But either of those, you just don't really see them in America. So I guess that helps explain some of that divide, that you, as you said, took a certain responsible action and paid it forward to the next generation of scholars who wouldn't necessarily have to make these wild wagers that you yourself did.
I mean, it's a problem of scale too. Like, one of the things that I've learned as someone who's been involved in, what in Australia is called research management, is that you have a scale problem. So if you are, and again, I always say this at conferences, if you are the lonely schizo in your university, the only person working on Deleuze, as I have frequently been, then you're always seen kind of isolated. You're doing that crazy thing that nobody else is really interested in. But if you are part of a conference that has 200 plus delegates at, if you are part of a book series, if you are publishing into a journal, then you can demonstrate scale. You can say, well, it's not just me as a lonely schizo out there on my own doing my thing. It's actually me as part of an international community that is kind of resonating literally all over the world. Like I've been to conferences on every single continent except Antarctica, where people are doing Deleuze. And so being able to demonstrate that to the institution is super important, particularly in Australia, but I assume also in the US, and I know it's important in the UK and across Europe as well. And I think that it's kind of important that we keep telling the institution that, so that it's not marginalized in an institutional sense. I mean, I had the same thing when I first organized the Deleuze conference. I thought the philosophy department at the university I was working at would be interested and supportive. And the head of philosophy there said to me, well, we don't read any French philosophers past Descartes. And that seems pretty narrow.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's been at least one or two Frenchmen that have been of interest since then, but not to him.
That seems like a typical response that you could see and I do feel like that and I'm not trying to anticipate too much, but that feels like a certain form of territoriality of philosophy departments. They are entrenched in certain subjects, certain periods, certain thinkers, and it does tend to lead to them being insular, as opposed to what we might think of as the interdisciplinarity of English departments or comp lit departments or whatnot. I don't think it's productive, but I guess that's
I agree. And it's not productive if it's closing out young scholars coming through and just making no place for them at all, making no place for new forms of thought, whether you agree or disagree with it. Like, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Badiou's work, but I wouldn't want to exclude a Badiou scholar from a philosophy department simply because I didn't agree with it. I think let them, do their thing. Let's see what's interesting. Let's see what kind of debates it generates and let's see where it takes us. So I think, the value of what Deleuze and Guattari has done as a kind of movement across institutions is compelled them to open up in places where they didn't necessarily want to. And it's brought in a kind of interdisciplinary ethic that I think is also very interesting and useful. And it has always been the sort of interdisciplinary departments that have been the most interested, like creative arts have been probably the most enthusiastic, comp lit, as you mentioned, but also politics to a certain extent, perhaps surprisingly. So I think it's also enabled a kind of, I hate to use the word, but it's probably correct, a rhizomatic network across disciplines where people sort of have an interest in Deleuze as a sort of origin scholar, but then develop their own problematics across their own disciplines, but are able to find kind of allies in other disciplines, whether it's creative arts or politics or whatever. And I think that's really interesting. And it creates a really nice environment at conferences where people come together and say, oh, well, in politics we do this, or in philosophy we do that. And I find that sort of mutually reinforcing learning, if you like, to be very, very stimulating. And it's really exciting to me.
That's a really good point you make, because it does help there's a way in which one can have a tendency. I'm just thinking of this. You rightly point this out. You point out the thinkers like Badiou and Zizek, and they're not the only ones who think someone like Guattari may have ruined Deleuze or something like this. Whereas, in fact, even though A Thousand Plateaus seems to be, as you said, this most rhizomatic of books, and it goes through all these disciplines. And if you think about it, they themselves form these intense reading lists, right, for each other in order to compose Capitalism and Schizophrenia. But, for Deleuze, it's plain old philosophy. And just because it's dealing with these different domains, these different disciplines from, I mean, you pretty much name any one of them, and it's hard to say that there's not some sort of place where they address it. It's still doing philosophy. It's just perhaps, and again, this maybe it goes back to Deleuze's idea of systems and being a systematic thinker, except the system for him is already it's already heterogenetic and heterogenesis itself. So I think that idea of philosophy perhaps is a bit intimidating to philosophy departments that may want to stick to the old Deleuze, who they may see as a thinker in the history of philosophy. If they were going to let Deleuze himself in, the cutoff date might be like 68, 69, if logic of sense makes it in.
I mean, maybe Difference and Repetition, but I mean, Difference and Repetition is already a kind of wild book. So to even begin to think that that's philosophy in the old way, and he says as much at the start of Difference and Repetition. He says that, it's clear we can't do philosophy in the old way, and I think there is at least two reasons for that. On the one hand, new problematics have emerged. And so people like Jameson with his late capitalism and so forth, they want to talk about the changes that are happening in what, vulgar Marxism referred to as the base. But we have to see it more broadly than that. There was a major revolution in the economic organization of the world that was occurring at the time at which they were writing A Thousand Plateaus. So new problematics were emerging all the time. But you can't write about new problematics in the old way without kind of sounding like you don't really know what you're talking about, and also without recognizing the depth of change goes to the point where even concepts you thought you knew, like ontology, for instance, must also be rethought because it's transforming them as well. And so that then requires a new form of writing. And this is why, like, people always think I'm crazy when I say that Jameson is the best sort of mediator to come to Deleuze and Guattari. But what he always says is that writing always confronts a representational problem. And so if you look at A Thousand Plateaus, it confronts a representational problem, which is, how do we write about this strange new thing in a way that doesn't make it seem like it's in continuity with the old thing, and at the same time doesn't sort of immediately recapitulate everything as concepts that we already knew, but takes us forward in a new way and compels us to think about new things in a new way. So there is a representational problem that is confronted in the writing of A Thousand Plateaus that goes hand in hand with the sort of intellectual problematics that they were trying to grapple with. And I think that's what we have to try to understand as we read those two volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, is that there are a series of representational problems underpinning what they were trying to do.
This is good. And I guess it also helps to take care of a question that I didn't write down, but I've had in the back of my head, which was, you seem to deploy Jameson at certain points in your argument, and maybe that's because he would be one that might bring in those who either may not have heard of Deleuze's work or may be a little bit skeptical, like you may have been skeptical about Anti-Oedipus yourself, at the beginning. Is it in The Political Unconscious where he first sort of discusses a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari? I can't remember if that makes it into the work, but I know that would be.
It definitely does, but it's not the first one. It's the book on Wyndham Lewis, Fables of Aggression, where he first uses it, and that came out in 1979. I actually just wrote a piece on that as part of Jameson's 90th birthday celebrations, which is up on the Verso website. And I hadn't read that book in quite a while, and it was quite nice to go back to it and see how he uses the concepts of molar and molecular as a hermeneutic. The main reason, and for me, the main inspiration in using Jameson was The Political Unconscious. I first had read that, where he sort of says that the political unconscious is going to try to follow the Deleuze and Guattari's idea of a sort of imminent reading. And that was the reason why I invited him to that conference in Perth. And people lost their minds at that idea. And then it's like, he was writing about Deleuze long before any of us were even writing about Deleuze. And he was part of Brian Massumi's committee at Yale. He helped get Anti-Oedipus, translated and so forth. So he was like behind the scenes helping Deleuze and Guattari studies to come into being long before anybody knew that was ever going to be a thing. So it had always seemed appropriate to me, but other people much less so. But I also, at the time, again, I'd only just finished my PhD. I hadn't really read anything. And I read Marxism and Form because I thought it would be embarrassing not to have read that when he finally came to Perth. I got to meet him. And this is why I called my book Deleuzism a Metacommentary, because I was really fascinated by the idea of the metacommentary. And essentially what he says there is that every theory is also a language, like it's its own kind of language. And you have to try to understand the theory as though you were learning French or as though you were learning German. Learn what are the limits of that theoretical language, but also what are the things that it can do that other theoretical languages can't do. And that I've always carried that with me. As you're reading A Thousand Plateaus, you sort of think of it as a language. Well, what is it trying to do? What can it do that other books can't do because they don't share its language? But like any language, you also then want to understand what's its grammar, what is its syntax, what are the rules for using this language? And for me, that's what's taken me deeper and deeper into their work, is trying to really get into it as though I'm trying to learn, Hebrew or something, a complicated language that I have no real understanding of. And I find that super helpful to me as it sort of drives me as a reader of Deleuze and Guattari.
I mean, that makes sense for a number of reasons. One of which, as you describe in your first chapter, one of the strata that they discuss is the techno-semiological, which has translation as its operative condition. So it makes sense to think about 1,000 plateaus. I mean, to a certain extent, you do have to learn a new language, and you do have to learn how certain concepts are deployed and how they translate into these effects with other concepts. And I guess that's a great way of establishing the book we were going to talk about today. I know we did a lot of preparatory work, but it leads us into your book, Assemblage Theory and Method. Now, I did mention perhaps seeds of it could be in heterology, which, as you mentioned, wasn't published, but I read the abstract. I'm not sure how correct it is on, I guess, was it Murdoch University that holds?
Yeah, that's where it was written.
Yeah. So I read that and I thought, I can already see this interesting melding because it is looking at a kind of constructivist theory of subjectivity. And this would have been in your dissertation, but some of that translates into this interest in assemblage theory. And I was thinking that if 95 isn't quite the genesis, but maybe the preamble, you can at least see in 2008 in your reader's guide to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus that you already are interested in sort of interpreting assemblage in a way that would be rigorous and that leads up to your assemblage theory and method. I was also trying to trace your disagreements with Delanda over this because I think of him as sort of popularizing this interest in assemblage theory, right? But you can already see in 2008, one of your critiques focuses on this notion that assemblages can be explained merely by, or really it's not assemblages, it's the socius, right? Can be explained merely by a sort of scaling up of elements. But that critique is similar to some of the critiques you have of the usages of assemblage. So I guess I wanted to give you a chance, instead of formulating a question per se, or a basic question is, when did this interest in assemblage theory, when and how, why did it all sort of come together for you? Because you were also writing articles on it, at least in 2015 and 2017 that I saw, right? So I'm curious how this, not to pun, scaled up into a book.
Yeah, well, I don't think I can take credit that when I was writing my thesis that I had any idea about assemblage theory. But it's certainly the problematic that assemblage theory addresses was part of what I was interested in when I was writing my PhD, but I hadn't really grasped the centrality of the assemblage to Deleuze and Guattari's work. And it took me a long time before I did. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari's work is not easy to read, and I kind of progressed by finger holds of sort of thinking, well, okay, I kind of think I get this concept now, but maybe don't really know what this concept is. And it takes a while before you finally are willing to sort of take the leap and think, yeah, okay, I can see the forest now. I'm not just kind of bumping into trees. And so that took a while. I never really set out to write quite so much about Delanda as I ended up doing, but it just irritated me so much. And because it was like I was saying earlier, like it displays an unwillingness and a kind of a lack of generosity towards the work that he's working with, just to sort of say things like, oh, well, all this stuff's too confusing, so we're just going to condense it. We're just going to do this. I was like, come on. I mean, what kind of scholarship is that? Agree or disagree or have a critique, but let's have a critique that's based on what the authors are actually saying as opposed to what you kind of think they might be saying. And anyway, you don't really care because you're just going to go off and do your own thing. So, do your own thing, but let's not pretend that you're actually drawing anything from Deleuze. So for me, it was kind of emblematic of the worst form of scholarship. And it was being cited so much that it just pissed me off. I was like, I'm going to all these conferences and people are citing all this stuff and it's just wrong. It's bad scholarship and I hate it. And so it kind of started to irritate me. And I thought, well, let's go and have a look at what assemblage really means. And so I started to dive into it. And then because Delanda's stuff was being cited so much, it felt kind of necessary to begin to write a corrective and say, well, actually, no, this is not really what Deleuze and Guattari actually say. And there's something much more interesting here if we dig into it, in a more kind of attentive way. And so I started to do that. And so like the book I'm currently working on extends that further by then bringing in the problematic of affect, which I think like affect theory is very similar to assemblage theory. It's this kind of a huge sprawling mess where nobody really agrees or has any idea what affect really means. And I'm not by any means going to try to resolve that problematic because it's far too big. But I am interested in the problematic of where does affect fit within Deleuze and Guattari's work. And the short version of that is that ultimately you have to start thinking about assemblages in terms of affect. So for me, it's quite a nice continuation of that project of being interested in assemblages and thinking, well, where does affect fit into that? And just sort of continuing on with that. So I guess, I became interested in assemblages as part of a general attempt to want to understand Deleuze and Guattari's work as much as possible. And just really noticing they say things like, that the assemblage is a kind of contribution to behavioral studies or to sort of the study of behavior. And then that's like a throwaway sentence in the middle of a 500-page book. And you're kind of like, well, that's kind of a momentous thing to be saying. So it helps us to reorient how we're thinking about this project and how they were thinking about it. And so I think, the idea of always trying to ask, well, what is the problematic that they are actually engaged in? What is the conversation they are trying to have? And who do they think they are talking to? And I think those kinds of questions, which all come out of Jameson as well, are really helpful. They bring you back to the text and make you look at it in a different way. And so once I started to think, well, who are they trying to talk to here? Who is this kind of whole book addressed to? And that made me think, well, perhaps we need to give much more thought to the assemblage than it's not just one of many concepts, but in fact, it might well be the concept that this book is trying to put forward. And eventually that's the conclusion that I reached.
I think that that's not a bad one. It is interesting. And I guess, a preliminary note, it is interesting that the notion of machinic assemblage does show up in Anti-Oedipus, but it really isn't even a quasi concept. It has 2 or 3 mentions, but it's never really worked out. And I also agree with you about agencement. In my view, works better as arrangement in order to correct some of the commonsensical assumptions at work in thinking of assemblages. And we can go through a couple of them, which is why in my my translation of Axel Chernyavsky's book, whenever I'm sort of quoting from across the Deleuze literature, I'm always modifying to, and I put that forward in the translator's introduction so that people know ahead of time when they see arrangement, it's agencement. A little bit frustratingly, because Axel has a background in Bergson, he also uses the word assemblage. Hopefully the translator's intro can at least cover that. But as you note too, Deleuze and Guattari also use the term assemblage in French as in English, but it's never with the conceptual unity that agencement assemblage has, right? And I do think it's interesting that some of the first translations of Deleuze and Guattari do translate agencement as arrangement. And last but not least, Brian Masumi was on about a month ago. And although it's awkward, I think he himself tried to self-correct his translation of agencement as assemblage by, in his latest forthcoming book, he uses the phraseology agencying. Now, I think it's fine in his work, and it's a little clumsy, but I see why it's not unwarranted. But on the other hand, because it's functioning as this kind of gerundive substantive, it doesn't quite fit into discussions. So in a certain sense, for me, you either leave it untranslated or you translate it as assemblage with all of its attendant, again, all of these presuppositions which you work through, or as you propose, and I think you give some reasons why, and maybe you can expand on that, you propose calling it arrangement. And I've talked to Cooper about this. I always liked arrangement because I think of it in terms of, for example, the refrain, the arrangement. We talk about arrangements of music. So it's more than simple ordering or placement side by side. There's, arrangement can be more abstract. Anyway, I didn't really have a question. I'm just reflecting a little bit as we start to dive into your book.
I mean, I like arrangement because I think that the musical dimension of it is quite useful because they often talk about music in terms of variation and the capacities of variation. And so arrangement to me is quite interesting, like, can you take a country and Western song and turn it into a pop song and vice versa? And we've got Beyonce now more or less doing that as a kind of live demonstration of what that might look like. But also arrangement, I think, carries the implication of a space and time, right? Like we made an arrangement to meet at a certain space and time. And so to me, that it's really that idea that it's that the arrangement is a meeting in space and time. It's where we agree to bring certain things together for this moment, or we arrange things in a certain way for a certain set of reasons. So I think arrangement works, but I don't use it as the general term. I still use assemblage because has so much currency now that if I was to start insisting on calling it arrangement theory, it would just disappear and no one would ever find it. Like, you have to write nowadays with a sense of discoverability. Like, if people Google assemblage, are they going to find my work? No, then it means literally it's a tree that's fallen in the forest and no one was there to hear it. So you have to pay attention to that. So I'm quite comfortable with doing that. And I think I've kind of put in all my concerns about the word as a translation. I emailed Brian and asked him why he arrived at that term. And he said to me that he thought, and his memory is probably as crap as mine, but he thought that this is not in any way meant to be disparaging towards him. Like, this is literally what he said to me, but Paul Patton had used it in the short translation that they did.
Oh, he's going to blame Paul.
Of the rhizome part. And so he just kind of continued with that. I don't think he was blaming Paul. I think it was more like,
I'm joking.
Paul had made that choice and it seemed kind of right. So they just decided to continue with it. And, would arrangement have been a better choice? I don't know. I don't necessarily think so. I think it's just one of those tough words that you can't quite capture in any one English word. For me, the most unfortunate side effect of using assemblage is that it's given rise to this sort of what I call a sort of natural language assumption, which is that assemblages are assembled and therefore you can talk about assembling and assembling and so on and so forth, which makes it seem like assemblages are just kind of cobbled together from things, which is really not at all how Deleuze and Guattari talk about it. They're much more like, no, the assemblage is kind of born fully ready-made, and then it, as a consequence of its existence, it brings things together. So we kind of get it the wrong way round. If we think about assemblages being cobbled together from things, then we don't see that actually an arrangement is, when you walk into a room, you think, I'm going to arrange this room. The idea of how you're going to do it pre-exists the moving of the chairs and the tables. I want to have it in a U shape, or I want to have small groups or whatever. That idea pre-exists the material reality of what you end up doing. And I think that's important if you want to try to understand the assemblage as a concept, is that it's what precedes and brings together the material arrangement. It's not the product of the material arrangement. And so, to my way of thinking, the most problematic aspect of both Jane Bennett and Manuel Delander's way of using assemblage is that they get it the wrong way round. They want to make the idea the product of the material rather than the material kind of like the product of the idea.
This is really helpful. It makes me think of one of my favorite undergraduate professors. Nietzsche scholar, and he was very kind of a Zen Buddhist and always wanted to, we would have these classes in a math classroom and all the desks are arranged in rows. First thing we always did before he even showed up, we started arranging the desks in a circle because it was meant to be a kind of seminar where class participation, a lot of the work was being done by students. And that kind of is a very basic notion of how that the arrangement is a product of desire to a certain extent, right? That there is a different type of classroom assemblage going on for his classes. And it also sheds light on one of the things that you said, at least I saw it in the Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis, one of your essays, and I saw it again in the book we're discussing today on assemblage theory, where what is it? The term is the actual factor is desiring production. The term actual is not used because it designates what is most recent, which is obviously what it means in French usually. And because it would be opposed to formal or infantile, which is how Freud means it. I'm kind of citing from memory Eurasides. It is used in terms of its difference with respect to virtual. And you say that these are some of the most consequential, or if not the most consequential lines in all of Deleuze and Guattari's writings. Does that sort of already dovetail to what you just said about some of your disagreements with Delanda and Bennett, who I assume would be two of the most prominent theorists of assemblage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of came across that sentence when I was writing about The Body Without Organs. And obviously I'd read it before, but, like a lot of things, you have to read it 20 times and the sun and the moon and the stars have to be in a line so that you actually pay attention in the right way at the right moment. I mean, those caveats are not mine. They're just lifted from Deleuze and Guattari's own footnotes. I mean, they actually specify that that's what they mean. And I thought, wow, we tend to think of the actual as the material and the virtual as the idea, as it were. And in effect, what they say is the reverse is true. The actual is the idea. It's what's resonating in your head, what's going on with your desire. And the virtual are just the kind of inanimate objects that surround you that have to be actualized by your intellectual engagement with them. Your desire attaches to them, you invest in them, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, we were kind of getting it the wrong way around. We're thinking that the mind is the virtual, the world is the actual. But for what Deleuze and Guattari is saying is that the opposite is the case. That actually the actual is the mind and the world is virtual until we engage it, until we make it part of what we're interested in doing. So I think it is one of the most consequential sentences in all of their work. And again, like so many of the really important ones, they just skim across it as you launch off down another pathway. But every now and again, you have to kind of trip over these things and think, what the hell are they really trying to say here? Because this is pretty kind of wild stuff. So let's, dwell with it a moment and think, well, what would be the consequences of us really taking this seriously, and how would it reorganize our thinking? So that's kind of what I was trying to suggest.
I may have misspoke. I think that it was not in the Incomplete Project. Maybe it was in your reader's guide to Anti-Oedipus, where you already had this idea that these are some of the most consequential lines. Because, and I'm just trying to clue the listener in, these lines are actually from Anti-Oedipus, and they're talking about it's the Oedipus complex that's virtual, right? And it has to be actualized in that triangularization.
I mean, it may be in both. I mean, to be honest, I can't remember. Like it's a while ago. And also the Incomplete Project was composed of essays that were written some of them started more than 20 years ago. So there was inevitably a bit of repetition between, essays that were written for two different kinds of venues and origins. And then you sort of bring them together and go, oh, hang on, I've sort of said a bit of the same here. I tried to edit a lot of that out, so hopefully the book is not finally too repetitious. But I think that particular sentence probably does appear in both books, because it's really kind of integral to how I want people to think about the idea of the body without organs, particularly.
I'm just reflecting on the fact that, in Anti-Oedipus, you would think you would see more of this discussion of the actual and virtual, but it's really confined to this little section, I believe in chapter 2 on the Holy Family, when they make this claim. And you would think you would see more of it, obviously, because it was so prominent in whether it be Logic of Sense or Deficit Repetition. But that's not one of the conceptual distinctions that makes its way into Anti-Oedipus, or at least the collective work with Deleuze and Guattari to a certain extent. You see it again in Immanence of Life, but I guess I'm just reflecting on that now. And it is something that you pass over. You don't necessarily focus on it too much. So that's, I'm glad that you brought that out.
And I think, when they're writing their book, they've kind of got their own agenda, and they just see that idea as a stepping stone in the direction to which they're going. And so I kind of get that from the perspective of somebody who's coming along reading their work. There are these moments that I said, like you trip over them. It's like a rock sticking out of the path, and you can't help but kick your toe on it. And so if you kind of get stuck on that and sort of think, well, where might that take us? You're still, to my way of thinking, you're still within the realm of thinking what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get us to think about, but it gives you the scope to then explore a whole set of other avenues without ever really leaving their work. And that's why I always described it as the Incomplete Project, because there are so many moments like that. Deleuze talks about Guattari being sort of the mountains and him being the ocean, or I can't remember, maybe it was the other way around now.
He's a hillside or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there are these moments where you're sort of still part of the sort of expanded universe of schizoanalysis, but you're nonetheless sort of exploring a territory that they at the barest just kind of put a dot on the map and leaving it for you to explore and to expand and to sort of fill in. So I like that about their work, that it's rich to the point of you won't ever exhaust it without at the same time having to kind of pretend that you're doing a new thing.
I've said this before, and I won't dwell on it, Coop. I'm sorry if I bore you with this, but I mean, reading something like 1,000 Plateaus with all the breadcrumbs they leave in the footnotes. I mean, just you can see the amount of work and the voracious reading and preparation that they did for the book. So many sources of which were untranslated, and still many of them are untranslated in English. That's what sparked the desire to translate And it started with wanting to translate, the Machine Unconscious, which is meant as a kind of workbook or a handbook for, I think he said it's a workbook. It's a little putting into play certain ideas that are meant to be in tandem with the Thousand Plateaus, one of which you helped me see a little bit more clearly. Guattari's got a chapter in Machine Unconscious precisely on ethology and how that exemplifies sort of what the assemblage is doing as a concept and what it's trying to sort of work through, whether it be in the sense of territorial assemblages, obviously in that case, though that's not the only type. That's an exemplary type for them. And so it helped to sort of bring into focus why Guattari is interested in ethology. And you say it in your introduction that the assemblage is meant to sort of replace notions of behavior because behavior already sort of presupposes assemblages. And I think that that's maybe one of the reasons to focus on ethology, even if disagreeing with some of the conclusions of it at the time. And the other thing, but I guess just to dovetail with the other book, the incomplete project of schizoanalysis, bringing together your essays, as you said, over the past 20 years or so. I do like how you were able to sort of, I guess, first of all, you sort of paint the field, right, in terms of where schizoanalysis fits into their project. And you say, I love this claim and I want to try to connect it with your interest to assemblages. I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot of preamble, but I really like the fact that you seem to say that their project is summarized in this construction of, I don't know if you want to call it a discipline, but it's this, we could say, an exploratory field that's unfinished and unfinishable. Kind of, you link it to Marx's permanent revolution, which I thought was brilliant. There's a sense in which there's a permanent revolution at play in assemblage theory, but also in schizoanalysis. And you say that that's their one project, right? Is to sort of bring life to this concept and field and exploratory domain of schizoanalysis. And so I guess I wanted to give you a chance do you see that as, if the assemblage is the concept from A Thousand Plateaus, then maybe the project would be schizoanalysis, something like that?
Yeah, I think so. Before I answer that, I want to go back to your point about the footnotes.
Okay, yeah.
Which is not a trivial point, because the footnotes are actually the evidence of it being a collective project, because most of those footnotes reflect work that the students brought to the seminars. So there's a kind of a real heterogeneity to the footnotes, but that comes from the fact that it's the 50-odd students in the room who Deleuze would be talking about the refrain or whatever, and they would all go away and come back, we found this, really cool example in sort of, 19th century music or 11th century music that we think really kind of resonates with your point. And I know that before I knew that, so when I was a PhD student, I remember reading those footnotes and thinking, who the hell has time to read all of this? Even allowing for the fact that they were in their late 40s, early 50s when they were writing this book. And I was only in my 20s and I possibly have read that much by that stage anyway. It was kind of a comfort to come back and actually understand that they probably didn't read all of it either. And certainly they didn't find all of it themselves. And so when they say that in the first page of the book that, each of us was several and that there's this real collectivity, they actually mean it. Like, it was genuinely how the book was written. It was written as seminars over a period of 7 years, at which Guattari participated and all the students participated. And that's starting to come out now with Dan Smith and Charles Stavali's translations of all the seminars, which were not available when I was doing my PhD. Although I knew that they had been recorded. So Richard Pinas had sort of recorded them. And so he was not the only one, but his recordings were massively extensive. And so that's all starting to come out now. So we can begin to understand it as a collective project. And that kind of goes hand in hand with my point that schizoanalysis is the sort of expanded universe. And really, when you see just what the students were able to do with these ideas, and they could bring all this work in and say, we've been reading this stuff about nomads in the sub-Saharan Africa. And you're like, yeah, that really seems to resonate with this. It kind of raises a problematic, which I think hasn't been dealt with enough. And certainly Deleuze and Guattari, they say it, but you have to be paying attention, is to ask the question, on what plane are all these things compatible and comparable, and can you actually bring them together? And so, in other words, where, Delander and so forth go wrong is that they sort of forget to ask, on what plane is possible. And Deleuze and Guattari are very explicit. They say it's only possible on a plane of immanence, which means that you are only ever bringing these things together on a conceptual level. It's not actually combining nomads in sub-Saharan Africa with, monk music from the 12th century or whatever. Actually, you're combining ideas, movements of desire, and so on and so forth on a plane of immanence. And so that's the point you have to really keep reminding yourself of. Otherwise, you start to get kind of caught up in thinking that they're talking about all these things as though they're all the same, but they're not doing that. They're actually saying there is a specific intellectual plane on which they become combinable. And so the question is always, well, what does that plane look like? How do we construct that plane? How do we construct the sort of intellectual presupposition? And they actually say, explicitly say that the abstract machine is essentially what must be presupposed in order for these things to have come together in the way that they have. And so there is always that problematic that we should keep coming back to. Well, what do we have to presuppose for this set of circumstances to be organized and arranged in the way that it is? And again, it's one of those sentences that they just dash off and you don't pay attention. You get caught up with the flow of what they're talking about, which at times is, it's pretty intriguing. You just go with it, right? So you have to kick your toe a few times before you finally stop and think, oh, yeah, okay, now I can see how this is being put together.
I'm really glad that you reiterated the fact that there was this collective work with the students. It's something that I hadn't thought about and I hadn't realized, and I know that you stated in your work. And again, it was something that I maybe passed over without really ruminating on that fact, that even if they were doing these intensive reading lists, it still is more work than two individuals could do by themselves. And you can see in the seminar lists that at least 3 or 4 years, I mean, you said 7, it's interesting, but at least we have available, I mean, they're at least starting in 75, if not earlier, and maybe in 74, Deleuze is doing Anti-Oedipus, Anti-Oedipus. There are these years of seminars, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, that show, I mean, even if they already had a little bit of 1,000 Plateaus constructed with the publication of Anti-Oedipus, they were working on it throughout the 70s. And I'm glad that you brought out that the students were contributing in ways that obviously they're particular footnotes aren't attributed to particular students, but it pays off. It pays these dividends. And hey, Coop, maybe the Dune reference was brought to them by one of their students. That's the one.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself. Because I'd always kind of just guessed that Guattari and his interest in kind of sci-fi and that sort of thing was the one to bring that to bear. But yeah, that's interesting. I think Children of Dune is the actual one cited in 1,000 Plateaus, which
I believe so.
Was published in 76, so it kind of tracks, but who knows?
There you go.
Could be Kenneth White as well. His stuff, it's probably from him that they start getting interested in nomadism. And so he's a Scottish poet who was at their seminars and was kind of obsessed with these things. And Edinburgh University Press have recently published 2 massive volumes of Kenneth White's work from this period. And I have to admit, I haven't dived too deeply into it yet, but I want to, but I've just been trying to do another thing that doesn't quite require that I do that just yet. So some of it's coming out, and I saw recently, and I just purchased it on Amazon. There's a new book of Guattari's writings that, if I understand it correctly, relates to his kind of notes that he was taking whilst he was at Laborde. I haven't seen the book yet, so I don't really know what it's about, but it certainly looks like something that would be great if it could be translated, because I've always said that, the great tragedy of Freud initially, that he just burned all his case notes. That was a great disaster. And I've always wondered whether or not Lacan had case notes and what happened to them. And the same with Guattari, because we know that Guattari was seeing private patients, so not just at Laborde, but also private patients outside of that, I think along fairly Lacanian lines of, quite short meetings and so forth. And I really wondered, what has happened to all that material? And it seems like it hasn't been burned. I don't know if it's ended up in the archive or not. I haven't looked through that too closely. I've never been to it, but I've spoken to people who have, and they don't seem to sort of suggest that there's a lot of case notes there. There's other interesting material, but not case notes. So, yeah, I've always wondered where they go, because part of what I want to do into the future, and I have to finish this stupid book on affect first, but one of the things that I have been interested in trying to think about is what I would call the sort of therapeutic dimension of 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus. And I kind of mean that in two senses. One is that Guattari's presence in those books is not really so much there in the writing. We kind of know, if Francois Doss's book is correct, that Deleuze did the majority of the actual writing. And you kind of get that from Guattari's notes, where he constantly complains, oh, Deleuze doesn't listen to me. I send him all these notes, but he doesn't listen. But, what a great friendship that they could still keep writing books together, even though one of them wasn't listening to the other. So I quite admire that aspect of their partnership as well. But you kind of, when you think, what does Guattari contribute to this project? And obviously lots of things, but the thing that's really distinctive, and I don't think people pay enough attention to, is the fact that it's tied very much to an understanding of the schizophrenic experience, which can only come from his encounter with schizophrenics, because Deleuze was very clear that he never wanted to meet schizophrenics. They scared him and whatever. And so whenever you are trying to think about the sort of schizophrenic dimension of those two books, that is Guattari. That's him coming to Deleuze and saying, you have to rethink all of your language philosophy, the logic of sense. You have to rethink what that really means. And we know from Doss's biography that Deleuze himself felt that limit with the logic of sense. And that's why he wanted to talk to someone like Guattari. He didn't know of Guattari at that point, but he was introduced to Guattari. And it's obviously why they suddenly got on, because Guattari must have said to him, look, your book is interesting, but these are the limits of it once we start talking to schizophrenics in the full flight of delirium and so on and so forth. And I think that intrigued them. But you then have to think, well, how does that come into these projects? And so both of those books are always talking about the limit of sense. And that is Guattari's contribution, is the limit of sense. What does it look like once we cross past the limit of sense? And what does creativity, what is productivity, what does the mind, what does the unconscious look like? All of that is Guattari. And so those people who say that, Guattari just politicized Deleuze, absolute nonsense. I mean, Deleuze was already political, because you can't imagine someone who is completely apolitical wanting to work with someone who is an avowed radical political.
Right.
Just not going to happen, right? So Deleuze must have already had strong political sensibilities that were compatible with what Guattari wanted to do. Even if, for his own reasons, he didn't really write about it or didn't want to go to meetings or rallies or whatever, they must have already been strong within him. Otherwise, they couldn't possibly have worked together. They just would have irritated each other too much. So what he gets from Guattari is an experience, a sort of empirical experience with things that go beyond the empirical understanding, that go beyond what can be written about in philosophy at that point. And that drives the project. But the other part of it is Guattari saying, well, what do we do with people who have schizophrenia, people who have these kind of deliriums that are disabling in all kinds of ways that make it unsafe for them to be out in the world? And it's always important to remember that neither of them were actually in favor of the sort of open the asylums problem movement that was happening in the 1970s. They didn't support Lang and Cooper's project. They didn't support the open asylum project in Italy either. They both said there is a place for the institution. They didn't mean that the asylums should be horrible places like they had been, but it did mean that there are certain circumstances where it would simply be not safe for someone to be outside of the institution. They need that sort of protection and support and whatever. People that are completely catatonic, can't feed themselves, can't look after themselves, the institution is the right place, but the institution can be a sign of a caring society as opposed to a sign of a society that doesn't care. And I've always thought that, in Guattari's book on, or the book that comes out as sort of Molecular Revolution in Brazil, the most kind of insistent thing he says throughout that whole book is, if you don't like how society is, then you have to invent new institutions. And it's institutions that change society. They bring people together, they are functional, they do things, so invent new institutions. So their response to the sort of open asylum movement was always, no, we don't want to just simply throw people out on the streets. We need to invent better institutions. And so that then presents a kind of therapeutic problem of, well, what would it look like to actually create a better institution, and what would it look like to actually care for people with schizophrenia in a more kind of compassionate, effective, and in a way that was mindful of their realities. And Guattari frequently says, we have to reserve the right for them to be mad. We can't try to change them. We can't dismiss their experiences. We can't just simply write it off and just load them up with drugs so that they don't have any experience. So I think it presents really interesting problems, and it recurs through 1,000 Plateaus in particular, where you come back to the question of, well, why are they talking about the rhizome? Well, they're talking about the rhizome as a therapeutic solution. They're saying if you get stuck on a particularly obsessive idea or you're feeling really depressed or anxious or whatever, then you need to be able to branch out of that mood, out of that state of being, and you find a new way to go forward. And so that's the rhizome. And so I find that if you start to think about the therapeutic dimension of that, the ways by which they say this is how you can kind of keep yourself going, keep making progress, not get stuck on things that are really negative, then again, it offers a new way of reading the book. And for me, the perhaps most interesting part of that is to then come back to the question of the war machine, because they're quite clear. They're not actually talking about war. They're not really interested in people being, shot and killed and so on and so forth. And they eventually sort of talk about the war machine as a sort of metamorphic process. And eventually, I think you realize that when they're talking about the war machine, they're talking about a kind of capacity of the mind to self-destruct. That there is a part of our mind that just can curl back on itself and be hyper-destructive in terms of how we are able to function in the world. But it also has a capacity to make us super creative, to see things in a new way, to push through and produce brilliant things. But it always has this capacity to become destructive, to become amenable to the sort of seductions of fascism and so on. And so to me, the war machine becomes a much more interesting concept once we start to think of it as it's trying to engage with a problematic that we might want to think of as psychological, but it's not strictly speaking psychological, but it's certainly affective. It certainly relates to questions of sociality and so forth. And to me, that's why it's interesting to think about the therapeutic dimension of their project.
I think that you nicely circled back around to tying the project of schizoanalysis to this question of assemblages, right? Because when they talk about, and this is something that Coop and I have talked about a lot, but they have a very cautious tone in A Thousand Plateaus where they're like, look, just because strata are perhaps unfortunate, but also beneficial. So destratifying too quickly and wildly, that obviously is not what they are advocating for. They do have this more sustained approach to, how is it they say, lodge yourself on a stratum and gently tip the assemblage toward the body without organs, towards the plane of consistency. It's not just about desubjectifying, designifying, and what's the other and then getting rid of all the organs or something, the deorganizing the organism. It has to be done experimentally, case by case, and in a way that is, and I like that you bring up, for example, black holes, this thing that Guattari was fascinated about, that sometimes this experimentation, this destratification, can lead into a certain black hole, which could be overwhelming and could potentially threaten. It's one of the machine effects of the assemblage, so it can potentially threaten everything and even lead down a suicidal line of flight, as we see in the case of fascism, but it could potentially be a necessary stepping stone along the way to unlocking new vectors of creativity. And this is, I think, really well borne out in Guattari's analysis of Proust in The Machine of Unconscious, where he shows the pitfalls of Swann and how Swann gets locked into a black hole, and that the narrator seemingly falls into a similar type, but is able to avoid it through the deterritorialized refrain, the Von Tweel's little phrase, whatever. He works it out at a certain point, but it's really interesting that the black hole can obviously threaten, but it doesn't necessarily always indicate failure, or that the breakdown could be a breakthrough, etc. There's obviously various little refrains we could bring in to describe it, but I like that you sat with the notion of black holes as a part of the assemblage and not necessarily it being the end all of everything, that it could potentially be a momentary blockage. And I think that goes into, that already shades into the therapeutic dimension of assemblages and assemblage theory and schizoanalysis.
Oh yeah, I don't think you can think about it except that way. The black hole really is, I think, one of the most clear-cut therapeutic concepts within the whole book. And I think what's not kind of talked about enough is the connection between the black hole and the idea of the rhizome. The rhizome really is your lifeline out of the black hole. And so when they say make a rhizome, they're essentially saying if you're stuck in a black hole, then you have to find your way out of it. And your way out of it is by being able to make connections with anything that's not from within the black hole. And I had a nice conversation with one of my students recently who is writing a project around sort of contemporary forms of fascism. And he was saying how he thought that there were sort of rhizomatic connections between these fascist groups. And I kind of paused him at that point and said, it's a really interesting problem that as far as I can recall, and I've read A Thousand Plateaus a lot, I cannot think of a single moment where they would use the rhizome as a concept to talk about the connection for something like fascism. They wouldn't they don't talk about fascism as a rhizomatic connection between, people who want to kill people. So there is something interesting about that to me. Like you could conceivably see the connections between different fascist groups as rhizomatic, but I think it's my memory, if you like, that they do not do that anywhere. They talk about fascism in terms of resonance, but never rhizomes. And so that then brings us back to a quite interesting idea around the rhizome, that it only has an affirmative dimension, that there is no negative dimension to the rhizome. There is no way by which sort of what we would think of as negative connections occur rhizomatically. Now, that may just be a sort of conceptual flaw, or it may well be telling us something very important about how they conceived of the idea of the rhizome. It was a really interesting conversation to have, and I've sent him away to do more work on it to see whether or not I'm right or wrong. That's one of the great things about having students. They get to do that work for you, part of his project. So it's not just, slave labor, but it's an interesting problematic to me, and not one that I'd thought of prior to that conversation.
I'm trying to remember, they describe it as a suicidal line of flight, but also this resonance of micro black holes, right? Am I?
Yeah.
Microfascism, at least. And I think the only way that the rhizome, they do caution that obviously the rhizome can sort of collapse in and branch and turn into the tree structure, right? But tree structures can also blossom into rhizomes, because with any concept, we're always going to see some mixtures, whether it be regimes of signs or smooth and striated, et cetera. That's just their warning, that kind of like with, supple segmentarity, don't believe a little bit of suppleness is going to save us. They're definitely cautionary about, and I think this is the brilliance of the notion of microfascism, is don't believe that just because you're sort of on the molecular level that these types of destructive phenomena can't creep up. But that is a fascinating question about the rhizome and fascism, and what type of conceptual productions could be brought into play by looking at their relation or not.
I mean, I think the connection to the tree has to do with, if you're like an analyst and you sort of make a rhizomatic connection back to, mummy and daddy or whatever, what they're saying is the pathway out is not to find your way to a sort of hierarchical connection that repositions you as the child in relation to a power structure. So the sort of, tree versus rhizome thing, it kind of becomes overblown rhetorically. But I think one could say that simply what they're really trying to say is that the way out is not to resort to older models of how your life should be organized, and to sort of take the risk of moving outside of that framework. But also we shouldn't be I talk about this a lot, but I never forget being at this Deleuze conference in Canada, where this young student got up and said that they had spent the previous 6 months studying plant biology in order to better understand the rhizome as a concept. And I remember thinking, that's just bonkers. There's nothing about reading plant biology that's going to make you understand that concept any better, because as if Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say that our daily lives are organized in the same way as plants are, like, it's just idiotic.
Literally getting in the weeds, right?
Right. So I didn't have the heart to say to them, man, you really should have spent your time reading Deleuze. It would have been a lot more productive. But you kind of encounter this kind of pivot amongst sort of students and Deleuze Guattari scholars quite frequently at conferences. You'd be listening to someone who'll say, oh, wow, I've just, been reading all this stuff about, plant biology and whatever. And I think, I don't know that was the right way to go. But I think you can get a lot from it. Like, I read that book by Simard called In Search of the Mother Tree. But it's not the plant biology that comes out of it that's super interesting to me. What's interesting is the philosophical dimension. So her whole argument is essentially, like, she comes from a forestry background in Canada, and she was all about forest regeneration, like how to, get forests to grow again after they've been clear felled for forestry, to make wood and paper and whatever. And so her project was always, well, how do we do this better? But what she comes to realize and comes to propose is that the whole understanding of the forest was completely wrong. that all the tree forest, sort of forestry people had been thinking about trees as being in competition with one another. And therefore, in order to allow the new trees the maximum opportunity to grow, you had to simply just pulverize everything else that was around them to create this clear space for them to grow. And eventually she shows scientifically that in fact it's the absolute opposite is the truth, that the trees grow cooperatively and that they are connected in sort of deep underground ways by fungi and all the rest of it. And loads of people have done the science on this.
Right.
But the important part is not the science. The important part is the philosophy, that they have been completely wrong in thinking about it competitively. And it wasn't until they began to think about it as a cooperative that they actually saw the science better. Like the science followed the sort of philosophical assumption was, well, actually, what if it's not competition? What if it's cooperation? And then they started to look for different things, and then they started to be able to do forestry different. But what's interesting is that the idea of competition has persisted in the face of the welter of sort of scientific evidence that's saying, well, no, it's not competition. It really is cooperation. You have to leave some of the old trees in order to create the congenial environment for the new trees to grow. If you clear fell everything and just pulverize, scorched earth, the new trees don't have the support networks they need to be able to be resilient in the face of drought and whatever. And once you start to say all that, it sounds completely obvious, right? And yet it wasn't. It took decades of science before someone, and this woman in particular, decided to flip how they were thinking about it. And to me, that's philosophy. So like if someone's reading plant biology and they come out of it with a philosophical idea, then they're exactly doing what Deleuze and Guattari are doing. If they come out of it with the idea, well, now we have to think about people being like grass and they do this and do that just like grass does, then you've kind of completely missed the point.
I guess that's the noological dimension, that there was an image of thought dominant in a certain domain of thinking that stifled and obstructed a more productive way of doing things, right? That's the study of images of thought is also one of those interesting aspects, one of the interesting outcomes of particularly, I think, the War Machine plateau, right, that we just discussed, where they talk about there's this noological dimension to the War Machine. So yeah, that's what I was thinking of. And that's just, I mean, you could say that's a particularly Deleuzian flavor of philosophy, but I do think that, the centrality of image of thought, that gets taken back up in A Thousand Plateaus in an interesting way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's something that we could do a lot more with that the ways by which certain ideas take hold and we just can't seem to shift them. There's an Australian economist called John Quiggin who published a book called Zombie Ideas. And it's a sort of a long list of economic ideas that he says that you just can't kill them. Like you can prove them to be false and to be economically disastrous, but you can't kill the idea. And to me, that's always sort of been how I think of the image of thought. Like the image of thought is an unkillable idea that even if we prove it empirically to be false, to be disastrous, it doesn't go away. And so many economic ideas are like that. And a lot of economic ideas would be much better if we thought of them in terms of cooperation rather than competition as well. So like if we were to take that idea through into economic and start to think, well, what would a cooperative economy look like as opposed to a competitive economy? And that would be quite a vastly different way of organizing our sort of material existence.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess that's the the double bind of common sense and good sense that makes these ideas keep returning from the dead. Even if they've been refuted, they just keep on living. So that's really fascinating. I know we're about at the hour and a half mark. I usually end with what you were going to be writing about, but you've already let us know that you're writing on affect. And I think that that's important because, gosh, I'm thinking of it's the Becoming Animal plateau, where I guess what is it? Memories of a Spinozist, where they kind of go into longitude and latitude affects and all of this. So, we'll get to see a lot of that. And I'm glad that it's expanding upon your book on assemblage theory, because I was a little let down that your fifth chapter ends and I wanted to see more. So we are going to see more. So instead of asking about what you're working on, since you've already kind of let us know, I want to give you the chance. Maybe we could end on a light note, since we've been talking about Thousand Plateaus a little bit. You bring up the fact that, Masumi in his user's guide, maybe it's the translator's introduction, where he suggests 1,000 Plateaus can be read as one listens to a record. And I know listeners are like, what's a record? But you can choose your favorite plateau and revisit it. And so I wanted to give you the chance, even though you argue against this method, when you pick up 1,000 plateaus, do you feel drawn to a particular plateau? Obviously, the assemblage kind of cuts across many of them in certain places. And we can think about the way they wrote it, like they talk about lines and concepts like ants sort of going between plateaus. But do you feel drawn to any in particular, or is that itself a sort of movement of the assemblage, that desire component?
Yeah, I don't think I would now say that I'm drawn to any particular chapter. I mean, I have read it so many times that I sort of feel like I'm looking down at it from the moon, so that what I see is not so much individual chapters as sort of topographical lines that go across an entire planet. So I become much more interested in trying to trace the lines of ideas through. I guess I would say that there are chapters that strike me as being underread and underthought about. And of those chapters, I think the one on the short story and the tale,
the novellas, yeah.
The novellas, that is the most underrated chapter. And I gave a talk about that at a health conference in Auckland a little while ago. And what I took from that chapter, which I think was, and which I said to these people in this health conference that I thought was relevant to them, was the idea of the segment. And so it's a public health conference, not a sort of, they're not the people that are looking down microscopes trying to understand microbes or whatever, but more the sort of public health dimension that are interested in, how do we get people to quit smoking, for example? How do we design better mental health programs and so on and so forth. But a lot of what they do as part of their research is interviewing people. And so there was one group of researchers that were at the conference, and they gave a presentation, and they'd been talking to cancer survivors, like to people who had been told, we more or less expect you're going to die within the next year, and who hadn't died and had far exceeded anyone's expectations and lived for a decade or whatever. And so they had some quite nice stories that they were relating from how these people were saying that, being told they were going to die, they're not dying, and how they'd had to, one person had sort of thought, well, I'm going to die, and they'd sold their apartment and whatever, and then they didn't die, and then they had to kind of reorganize their life. So what I was saying is that what the tale and the novella and the short story, what that analysis brings out is this idea of the segments and of how we connect the segments of our lives together. And so I was trying to propose a kind of a model for doing ethnographic work, of listening to people tell their stories and then thinking, well, how do we analyze these stories? And so I was suggesting that, well, we can think about the segments. What are the segments that people talk about? But more importantly, how do people talk about fitting those segments together? If I thought I was going to die, then I didn't die, and then suddenly I had a life before me that I hadn't really thought I was going to have. And so I had to ask myself the question, well, what am I going to do with this life? And so I was quite fascinated by that as an idea. And so I guess I would say that chapter to me feels like it's a resource that hasn't been mined as deeply as perhaps some of the other chapters have. And I think that's partly because people don't come from a literary background. I came from a literary cultural studies background. I came to Deleuze as someone who was teaching literature and was quite interested in the literary dimension as well. And I think that's why Jameson is such a great reader as well. He also comes from the literary background. And so being interested in what they are saying literature does and can do, I think that's an underdeveloped resource within their work, that people haven't spent enough time thinking about why they use literature and what they think literature can do for us as people who are interested in philosophy or cultural studies or everyday life or health, in fact. So I guess that would be where I would suggest people take another look.
I think that's really important because a few things, one of which is their quip about, is it our fault that these literary authors that they look to, you can name half a dozen, obviously Artaud being one of them, but they name Lawrence, Artaud, Miller, et cetera, that they're sort of more acquainted with desire on the level of delirium, schizophrenia, that they explore that dimension more effectively than psychoanalysis ever did. And then the other thing I think, well, I guess I had three things. One was that. Two was the fact that they want to, in the Anti-Oedipus, they're talking about setting the revolutionary machine in to mesh with the analytic machine, but it's also the literary machine, the art machine is sort of at play too. And you can see that throughout the whole capitalism and schizophrenia project, including the sort of interim of the Kafka book on minor literature. And then Essays Critical and Clinical, right? Where it is this interesting way in which Deleuze returns, or not necessarily they ever left, but he explores the therapeutic, so to speak, aspect of literature and brings out or sort of articulates together the literary machine and the therapeutic machine, to speak sort of loosely, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about literature as being diagnostic. If you ask what are they diagnosing, well, precisely they're diagnosing or bringing to light assemblages. They're bringing to light the kinds of arrangements of people's desire, places where they get stuck, but also ways by which people are able to make their way forward in life. And I think that's what they sort of say about Masoch, that masochism is simultaneously a kind of a black hole in which a certain form of desire gets stuck, but it is also, as Freud always said, an attempt at self-cure. It's their way of being able to keep going forward. So I think that that's also part of that sort of therapeutic dimension, is the sort of the diagnosis, the identification of how a particular assemblage or desiring machine works, but also then to see how that is simultaneously, on the one hand, perhaps problematic, but on the other hand, also a kind of a self-cure.
Well, this is great, and again, you're sort of wrapping back around to your current project, and so I think that's great. So it did give you some space to enlighten us a little bit about what you're working on, and I guess what I'll do here is just suggest, as you get closer to completing it, or when you complete it, maybe you can us, because I know. Yes, we didn't necessarily dive into the details of your book, Assemblage Theory, too much, but we were able to, I think, sort of mobilize a lot of the work surrounding it, and maybe give an appetizer, if you will, whet the listener's appetite to sort of look forward and dive into your work. I suggest it, and including your editorial work that we discussed at the very beginning. So here's an open invitation, extending, as Guattari says, I guess at the end of Chaosmosis, I hold my hand out to the future. Here's us holding our hands out to welcome you back on in the future. I guess, are you still in the midst of writing it?
Yeah, so it was due at the publishers about 3 years ago. And so it has defied any attempt to be finished. I have written at least twice as many words as was ever contracted and required. But the book is still going to be short. It was a far gnarlier problem than I had ever anticipated. I kind of thought I knew what it meant when I dived into it. And then, it's that classic quote that Deleuze always quotes from Leibniz of, I thought I had found safe harbor, but in fact I was all at sea. And so it's taken me quite a while to navigate my way back to being in safe harbor. So I feel like I can now finish the book, but I had to go down a lot of false trails before I got to the point where I thought I really understand this concept now in a way that's productive and useful and not trivial. Yeah, it was a much harder project than I anticipated, and I would be delighted to talk people through the torturous pathways of getting to where I have got to now. So thank you for the invitation.
This episode will drop at about 3 weeks. So I'll be in touch with you as that process goes along. And when it airs, you can share it with whomever you like. You can listen back. And again, we'll be in touch. And I really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been really great to talk to you, and look forward to doing it again.
Thanks once again to Ian Buchanan for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.